Good morning, everyone. Am I on, Steve? I am? Okay, good. Okay, so we didn't have class last week because of the storm, which of course we all know, but I'm only putting this in here in case somebody watches this saying, well, what happened to last week's episode? We're going to know we didn't have it because we didn't have church because of that snowstorm here. So the last topic we'll talk about is the structure of the revelation here. My clicker's not working? No. What? Well, I mean, it could have been. Opening quote. A final obstacle that makes Revelation a closed book to many modern readers is the belief that it is a bewildering collection of fragments, too formless to grasp at once. The impression is created partly by the brevity of the individual units that make up the procession or pageant of visions, but the writer worked overtime to ensure that this kaleidoscope of individual units would not be chaotic. With a book containing so many individual units, numerous structural schemes can be successfully applied here. So what does that mean for us today? Outlining the book will be challenging. One author wrote, there are almost as many outlines for the Apocalypse as there are commentaries. So if you have study Bibles, you're going to have an outline in it. If you have books of sermons, you're going to have an outline in it. If you look at something online, you're going to have outlines in it. And they just all run the gambit of all kinds of almost diametrically opposed sort of approaches here. Because the revelation itself is so complicated that we have a hard time trying to figure out exactly how we should structure it. So let's go ahead and look at a few different outlines that have been proposed. And the advantage of us seeing different outlines is that we can see different ways in which to approach the revelation. So if we are used to seeing things A, B, C, D, and somebody says, well, no, it really should be A, B, C, B, A, well then, once we see that work in that format, then we'll understand the author is emphasizing something different than what we perhaps originally thought. So the easiest way to do it is a two-part outline. You get a prologue, talking about part 1, the sealed scroll, so from chapter 1 through chapter 11, and then part 2, the open scroll, chapter 12 through chapter 22, and then the epilogue. So at least in our time period today, most every writer agrees that we have a prologue, first 8 verses, an epilogue, and we debate exactly where that starts and ends. But everybody agrees about that. Everybody agrees that there is a transition between the end of chapter 11 and chapter 12. Because chapter 11, you have the 2 witnesses, and then you have this judgment scene, and then in chapter 12, you have this woman, the dragon, man-child, and all kinds of fantastic imagery here. Come on in, mister. You know, I waited. I just waited. I even talked about the snowstorm. That's probably why you're a little late. So this is simplest outline. Okay. And we talked about that. Good. Okay. A slightly more complicated one would be this way. It's a 3-part. This author says preparation of the prophet, his past vision, so chapter 1. Preparation of the people, their present conditions, chapter 2 through 3. And publication of the prophecy, its future expectations, chapter 4 through 22. So some people will look at chapter 1 and verse 19 as a structural element and saying that what John is writing is about the past, the present, and the future. And so they'll look at chapter 1 as the past, because John has already experienced those things. He's writing about it from the past. The present, about what the churches are going through. And then starting chapter 4 through the end, that's all in the future. I was just looking at one guy last week, and he was showing this progression here, and he had tied in one of the seals or one of the trumpets with COVID, and then he had a bunch of blank spots because he really wasn't sure how those future events, if they had yet come to pass or not here. Yes. Okay, good. Outline 3. This is a little more complicated. And you can see he goes a prologue, and then he goes promises, God's work, God's wrath, commissioning, great controversy, then he goes it back out. So if you look, you see A, B, C, D, E, F, and then E prime, D prime, C prime, B prime, A prime. So that's a mirror image approach here. And let's talk about that for a second here. What he means is that you see D and D prime, those sections go together. So he entitles it God's wrath mixed with mercy, chapters 8 and 9. And then God's final wrath unmixed with mercy, chapters 15 through 18. And then C prime, so C was God's work for man's salvation, 4 through 8. C prime is God's work for man's salvation completed, 19 through 21. And then B was promises to the overcomers, 1 through 3, and fulfillment of the promises to the overcomer, chapter 21 through 22. So this is called a chiastic approach. And the Bible does use chiastic approaches. I don't subscribe to the whole book being organized this way, because while on paper it looks good, when you read the sections, you're like, well, I don't know if that's really the theme of those 2 chapters or whatnot here. So on paper, you can always make a chiastic approach look well, but more times than not, it's just the author read it into something here. However, we do want to realize that the Bible does present any number of small sections in this sort of format. And let me go back here for a second. In a chiastic, the F section, right in the center, great controversy between Christ and Satan, that's almost always the emphasis the author is trying to make. So when they organize it that way, the center point is what they want you to pay attention to. And so everything builds to the center and then builds back down from the center here. So let's go back. So you can see it's set up in parallel sections here. Now that's a new one. Questions? I don't want to rush through it. Okay. If you got questions, just yell out. Outline 4. Now this is, I should have edited that better. This is a different sort of one. So you see it has an introductory scene, and then the 7 churches, introductory scene, 7 seals, introductory scene, 7 trumpets, introductory scene, the wrath of nations, introductory scene, the wrath of God, introductory scene, the final judgment, introductory scene, New Jerusalem, and then, of course, prologue and epilogue here. So with this one, what the author who made the outline is trying to do is he's basing it off of various liturgical or worship settings in the Old Testament. So as we read the Revelation, we're going to see a lot of connections between the book of Exodus, the book of Leviticus, some Deuteronomy, along with all the Old Testament prophets here. And some people, when they read the Revelation, they see it as an expansion of a section out of Leviticus or an expansion of the 7 festivals, the 7 feasts, things along those lines here. It is true that the Revelation is presented in a worship setting. And so it certainly can be that case, that it's a worship setting here in the book. So there's always this possibility here. And what you'll find with outlines is that really the outline that makes most sense to you should be the one that you go with at least initially. Because the only purpose of an outline is just to give you something to hang your hat on as you're reading the book, so you don't get lost. Another outline is this one by Michael Wilcock, and he sets it up as 8 scenes. So he's looking at like a drama. And then another person did it as 7 scenes. So he did 2 acts with 7 scenes. So let's go through that one a little bit more here. So he gives a prologue, and he says the first act is creation, salvation through judgment. Then he does 7 scenes with intervals between each of those scenes. And then the second act, you see it starts in chapter 12, salvation through judgment, new creation. And again, he has another set of scenes with those intervals here. So these are based on a dramatic play idea. So in the first century, plays were very common. We sometimes think that only in today's world do we have so much entertainment that people waste their time binge watching various things. But that was distinctly possible in the first century as well. There were all kinds of plays, all kinds of performances going on of various levels, from G-rated things to X-rated things to in between. So everybody had plenty of opportunity to spend time watching things here. So as you read the Revelation, you definitely see that it has a story element to it here. We have some significant characters like the Lamb and then the dragon. We have the 7 churches. We have the sea beast, the earth beast. We have the kings that died, that came back. We have all these characters there, and they walk onto the scene for a little while, and then they walk off. And then they walk on again, and then they walk off. And so there is a certain level of truth to the idea that we can look at it as a dramatic play. And so one does it in 8 acts, the other one does it in 2 acts, but with 7 scenes. And of course, the 7 scenes are put there because, why? Yes.
What about the woman in the scene? You left out the woman in scene 12.
Well, I didn't. I mean, unless you're saying what I'm just saying here, yeah, so, but 7 is the number here. Say again? That's right. And I have lots of outlines to where the author will divide it up into 7 major sections. And then under each section, you'll have 7 unnamed visions, 7 prophecies, 7 this, 7 that. And it's real easy to find what you're looking for, but it's really challenging to find what John has there. And you can think about it when we are discussing things with one another, that while we see the same event or we read the same story, sometimes one of us interprets it vastly different than the rest of the group, and they just see things that nobody else sees. And you wonder why, but it's hard to tell here. It's important for us to realize that no one way addresses all concerns, but each way does address some concerns here. So with that first one, we saw that there's a definite division between first 11 chapters and 12 through the end. And as you're reading the book, you should notice that it culminates in chapter 11, and then it seems like start over again in chapter 12. And then if we look at the liturgical one, we see all these introductory scenes. So we have them go along with the story, and then all of a sudden it sort of stops, and then we have something else take place. So you'll see that especially when you read the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls. We're going along, and then all of a sudden it's interrupted, and then we get back to the seals or the bowls or the trumpets here. So I do want you to realize that there's more than one way in which to view the book. So I'm not saying any of these outlines are better or worse than anything else. They're just a way for us to organize it here. But I do want you to think about it because it gives you an opportunity to see things that you haven't necessarily saw before here. And just as a general rule, this is why you should always go through the exercise of you personally trying to read the Bible book and you outlining it yourself. Because as you outline it, you're trying to put a structure on it so that you can realize why chapter 5 comes after chapter 4, which came after chapter 3. And that act of doing that helps you understand that God really isn't a God of disorder. He has a purpose, He has a reason. And so when you do that for some of Paul's letters, you're like, okay. And then you get to the rest of the Bible, well, then you start to realize if it doesn't want to fit nicely the way you're doing it, well, maybe God had a different reason, and it's incumbent upon us to try to figure out why was God doing it this way. So the question I want to ask you guys is, how would John indicate structure? How would John indicate structure in his writing? Because maybe you don't know this, so you want to realize that when people wrote the manuscripts for the books of the Bible, that there were not usually section breaks, there were not chapter breaks, there were not even spaces between words. It was just all one run along sentence, you know. And this is why some translations have a completely different word than another translation, because they broke the word up differently here. So we have words that if we had no spaces, we could read it slightly different than somebody else here. So given that, how would he indicate structure? Any thoughts? No thoughts? Okay.
It seems to culminate in 12, seems to be one part of the story, and then from 12 on to 20, 21 is the other part of the story, because 12 is about a woman, 20 is about a bride.
Mm-hmm.
Christ. And so it seems like you have to fit whatever is, it seems like God is trying to give certain warnings, and then certain, like in Pharaoh's case, plagues.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, he was trying to get Pharaoh to do what he
No,
needed to do for Israel.
those are true, but how does John indicate that he's transitioning from one section to a new section? You know, well, let's just do this here. One way would be through the use of genre. I imagine all of you have read school books, and so we have a table of contents in a school book that tells us here's chapter 1, and we have a title saying here's what it's about, polynomials. And then we have subsection underneath that, and then we have practice problems, and we have whatever here. We read a novel, and some authors like to give titles to each of their chapters, so you have an idea what it's about. Other authors like to give ironic titles that are just sort of cutesy sort of thing here that have nothing to do with the actual content of the chapter here, but they do want you to frame your mind in a certain place. Other people just do 1 through 30. Now, as we're reading our books or our school books, we use paragraphs, we use indentation, we use a lot of various things with fonts. We use large size, bold size, italic size. We use bulletin, we use numbering, we use all kinds of things for structuring. You can see right here, I have the structure of the Revelation, so that's in a larger, bold size. So you can see that's like a title. And then I have a question mark, so we understand this is a question. And then I bold underneath that, so we understand this is all related to that question. So in the Revelation, we talked about that it was prophetic, that it was apocalyptic, and that it was, what was the third one we talked about? It was a letter, epistle. So those are the 3 main genres that John employed in this book here. And because he did those, we have certain expectations about what we're going to see or not see. And those give us an idea about how it's going to be organized. So when I read a study guide in the Revelation, I have certain expectations. And I see how it's organized. And the person is just going to answer a few questions big picture about certain things here. If I read a dissertation on some passage about the Revelation, well, then I fully expect the guy is going to open up by doing a review of what everybody said about his verse. And the main options here, he's going to do a background for ancient Near East, for a Greco-Roman, and then he's going to start going into his main part, talking about his verses, his words, and then he's going to wrap it all up with a conclusion and summarize what he's already said here. And then his outline will be extremely detailed in his table of contents, so you know exactly what he's going to talk about. So that's what we do today. But what would John do? Who would like to read Revelation 1 and verse 3 for the class? Gary? All right, thank you. So, what I want you to realize from that verse that we don't realize is that John wrote his book not to be read, but to be heard. All of us are readers to one degree or another. So, in my family, we read voluminous amounts of literature, good, bad, and in between. We read nonfiction, read fiction, we read all kinds of different things here. But not everybody does that. Some people just read what they're supposed to read. Some people read more, some people read less. But almost all of us read silently. In the first century, that wasn't a common practice at all. And as a matter of fact, in the 4th century, we have one author commenting that he walked in to go visit a bishop of the church, and he was shocked that the guy was reading silently. He only knew he was reading silently because he could see his lips moving. And that was completely foreign to him. For the most part, when people read, they read out loud. Now, we teach children to read out loud so they can hear some things, but eventually we get to the point where we want everybody to read silently, and then you can go faster, this, that, or whatnot. But the Bible almost entirely was meant to be read out loud. It was meant for us to hear what was said there. And when you hear things, you definitely get a different take on what's going on. So we need to look for any oral devices, so hearing devices used in the book. And an oral device would be anything that would make the work easier to remember. Because again, I have lots of books. On my dining room table, you can see 24 sections of paper that are different articles all about this here, and I got them scattered all over the place because I don't have to remember everything. However, in the 1st century, the centuries just after that, and definitely before that, you may only hear something one time. And if it's important to you, you're going to do your very best to remember it. And authors, when they wrote their work, they wrote it to be recited so people could remember that. That's why if you're old enough and you had to take Greek and Latin when you were younger, you would have read various poems of Homer. And people are always amazed that somebody would memorize all of that and be able to recite it at the drop of a hat, because that's what was intended to happen. They were meant to memorize it. And the Revelation really does lend itself to a lot of memorization if you're paying attention to the various clues he gives. So the two main ways we see in the Revelation is through the use of numbers. So as you read, you got a first seal, second seal, third seal, and those help prompt us to say, okay, I know what's going to be next, and you can hang your hat on that as you're reciting that. And then repetition of words or phrases that might indicate a transition. So let's look at one example. This isn't the only ones. This is just one of them that's important here. In the Spirit is a phrase that's used 4 times in the Revelation. So who would like to read Revelation 1:10, and then 4, 1 and 2, 17, and then 21? 4 readers, 1 per reader. Just Okay, that's chapter 1. Who would like to read chapter 4? Don't deprive yourself of the blessing, people. Just excellent. Go ahead. Thank you. Chapter 17.
There came one of the seven angels that had the seven bowls and spake with me, saying, Come hither, I will show thee the judgment of the great harlot that sitteth on the waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed fornication, and they that dwell in the earth were made drunken by the wine of her fornication. And he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting upon a scarlet colored beast, full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns.
All right. Who would like to read the last one? Revelation 21, 9 and 10.
One of the seven angels who had the seven bowls full of the seven last plagues came and said to me, Come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb. And he carried me away in the spirit to a mountain great and high, and showed me the holy city, Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God.
Okay, thank you. So, since we're used to reading silently, we don't necessarily pick up on repetition as it's presented in the work, except if we're being critical and we're saying, why is the author repeating an idea? So, I was reading an ancient work um, not too long ago, and I keep looking at him like, why is the guy repeating what he said? I mean, he just talked about this like a chapter ago. Why is he saying it again? Well, he's doing that because he wants that to be emphasized, and he wants that something that people are listening to and hearing, and they're going to clue in that this is significant. So the phrase in the Spirit is one of those transitional devices that John uses in the Revelation. So he says, I was in the Spirit in Patmos. And then he transitions to, I was in the Spirit, I was taken to heaven. And then I was in the Spirit taken to the wilderness, and I was in the Spirit taken to the mountain here. And each time he's taken to a different location. And that seems to be one of John's significant ways in which he transitions, shows I'm going from one section to another section to another section to another section here. One author writes, one of the key structural markers in the book of Revelation is a repeated phrase, in the Spirit. It occurs 4 times in 1:10, 4:2, 17:3, 21:10, punctuating major visionary segments of John's Apocalypse. This suggests that at a macro level, so a large level, Revelation may be divided into 4 major sections. 1:10 introduces the inaugural vision of Jesus Christ, who will address the 7 churches in chapters 2 through 3. Then 4:2 introduces the main visionary segments of the book, which begins with John's ascent into heaven, chapters 4 through 5. Then 2 uses in 17:3 and 21:10 introduce the 2 climactic and contrasting visions of the entire book: the prostitute, Babylon, 17 through 19, and the bride, New Jerusalem, 21 through 22. So each one of those transitional devices is one of John's way of saying, I'm moving to a new section. In modern day, we would say the author is making a chapter break here, or we'd say it's a large section break. So we have a tendency to group a number of chapters into a large section, overarching section here, and this is what John is doing with the phrase in the Spirit. Questions? Okay. Repeated phrases and numbers. So we see that John indicates structure by use of numbers, numbering the seals, trumpets, and bowls. So we know where they got 7, 7, and 7. So as you're reading that along, you're going to notice those things. And when you get to a certain one, you're like, oh, I was expecting this, but I didn't have that. Why didn't I have that? And so those are significant transitional points here. Another repeated phrase is found at the start and the end. So ancient writings did not have chapter divisions, section headings, or paragraph breaks. Since these works were mostly read aloud, the presence of these things would have been of no use anyways. And this is a side note. So I'll listen to audiobooks, and that really gets me all the time. So I'm listening to a book about being in Christ, and I don't know when the chapter starts necessarily, except that this audio section ended. And I don't know if what he's reading is the name of the chapter or if he's quoting some quote or anything like that, because I just don't have that visual feedback. And it does confuse me from time to time. I understand the overarching point the author's making as he's reading it, but I'm used to a lot of visual clues here. Did I read all that paragraph? No? Okay. Since these works are mostly read aloud, the presence of these things would have been of no use anyways. In order to help the reader, hearers follow along, ancient writers had to include verbal clues that would alert the readers, hearers of the beginning or close of a section. A common technique for an ancient author was to open and close a section of a book, or even the whole book, by means of the repetition of a key phrase, idea, or image. That is, an author might bracket a paragraph, a story, a larger section, or even a whole book with such a repetition. This literary device is called an inclusio, what we today accomplish by means of paragraph breaks, chapter breaks, and various section headings. An ancient author accomplished through inclusios. John used a number of inclusios to frame the entire work of Revelation. That is, there are key phrases that appear at the beginning and at the end of the book of Revelation that serve to frame the entire book. The use of inclusios to frame an entire work is similar to what a modern writer does in telling us their purpose in the introduction and then reiterating what they have done in the conclusion. By observing these inclusios in the book of Revelation, we're able to discern in large measure some of John's primary objectives in writing. And the use of inclusios, that's what we call it. That's not necessarily what they thought of it, but we see it throughout the whole entire Bible. We'll see that in the Gospels especially, that they'll start a story, and then all of a sudden the author breaks away to have another story, and then they'll come back to the other story and finish that up. And these things are related, and whatever's in the center is usually what the author's trying to emphasize, and then that center point is meant to help us understand the outside points as well. John uses a number of inclusios to frame the entire book of Revelation. That is, there are key phrases that appear at the beginning and the end of the book of Revelation that serve to frame the entire work. The use of inclusios to frame an entire work similar. Oh. Yes, that's similar. So just look at the last sentence here. By observing these inclusios in the book of Revelation, we're able to discern in large measure some of John's primary objectives in writing. And that's a good statement for us here. In 1:6, we see that John's introduction to the people of God affirms that they are a kingdom, priest to his God and Father. Then in Revelation 20, we see a group that is similarly described. They will be priests of God and of Christ, and they will reign with him for 1,000 years, in verse 6. The description in Revelation 1:6 reminds the readers of the charge to the Old Testament people of God given to Moses after the Israelites had crossed the Red Sea. In Exodus 19, the Israelites were informed that God had rescued them for a purpose. They were to be, to me, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And Revelation 19:6 is one of those verses that you want to have highlighted and be aware of out of the entire Old Testament. This description at the opening of Revelation likely serves to connect the New Testament people of God and their mission in the book of Revelation with the promises of God to the Israelites. That this description recurs at the close of the book of Revelation, forming an inclusio of chapter 1, affirms that one of the central aims of the book of Revelation is to exhort the readers to fulfill their mission. God has made us a kingdom, priest as God, and Father. So as they are reading the book out loud, as the people are hearing the book, they're hearing right from the very beginning this promise that references Exodus 19 and verse 6, which would have been something that was familiar to them. Just like it's familiar to a lot of Bible class teachers, a lot of ministers. We emphasize this is an important verse. You guys want to know it here. And then when we get to the end of the work, when we still have those same ideas, those same concepts reiterated, the author, John, wants you to remember that I opened it up by saying you were this, and I'm closing it by saying you're this. Therefore, it is important for you to realize you are, in fact, a kingdom priest to God, and what should you be doing? Which is the question John wants us to ask. If we're a kingdom, how should we act? If we are priests, how should we act? Here's some more examples, just a few of them here. Chapter 1, chapter 22, to show his servants things which soon take place. Jesus sends an angel. Blessed is he who heeds, that is, who listens, who obeys. So he opens the book that way, closes the book that way. The words of the prophecy, the time is near, the seven churches, the Alpha and the Omega. So these are all phrases that John opens up in chapter 1, and they're all reiterated at the end of his work. And so that means they are important for us to think about and realize as we're reading that. So when we read the Revelation, it's really easy for us to focus on our verse numbers and our chapter numbers and whatever heading our Bible translation put in there. But for John, he wanted to emphasize words and phrases, and he would repeat those throughout his work. And by repeating those, he's emphasizing this is an important idea. It's not always the case, but it's never accidental. So if he repeats something, there is a reason for that. That's why when people have classes on Acts, one of the questions you should ask is, well, why does Luke go through the effort of recording Paul's conversion 3 separate times? You know, what's the purpose in doing that here? Okay, let me go back here. So, inclusios, that might be a new term for you, but it's not necessarily a new concept. Bible class teachers would have pointed out and whatnot in various sections here. Any questions or anything I need to make clearer? Okay. So, one last question is about concerning the structure of Revelation is about chronology. Is a revelation chronological? That is to say, does the next recorded event happen later in time than the previous event? So, as you're reading John, you're seeing he says, and then, and then, and then, and then. And then I saw, and then I saw, and then I saw. So, by him doing that, is he trying to say, this event took place here, and then the next event takes place later than that, next event takes place later than that. So that second outline we saw, that divided up into 3 parts, that would say that everything is happening in a chronological order here. And so from chapter 4 on, you are not going to have the 7th seal until you have the first 6 seals. And then you're not going to have the trumpets until all the seals are complete. You're not going to have the bowls until all the trumpets are complete. You're not going to have this thing happening with Babylon, the whore, until these things are complete here. Most of our stories and movies are in chronological order, and we have a tendency to always read the Bible in that fashion. But a number of books are not arranged in chronological order, or they repeat material, which is, again, terribly confusing to people when they first become Christians. Because we're expecting that chapter 2 takes place chronologically after chapter 1. Unless the author says this is a flashback scene, we're going to go back here, you know. But even when we watch movies and the author, the director does that, sometimes it confuses us because we're like, what? Well, I thought this was this, and oh, okay, this happened here. And then we have to go back and watch it again, and we get our minds sorted around that it wasn't in chronological fashion here. When you read Jeremiah, he jumps all over the place. It's not in any sort of chronological order here. And when you read Daniel, you see the vision in chapter 2 is repeated a number of times in a slightly different format or fashion here. But chronologically speaking, chapter 8 doesn't take place later than chapter 2 when it's recording what's going to take place historically speaking here. The book of Revelation certainly contains a story. One of the more difficult questions pertains to the nature of that story. In particular, how does a story unfold? For some, the narrative of the book of Revelation unfolds in a linear fashion, from point A to point B. Generally speaking, proponents of this view contend that the events described in Revelation chapter 6 are real-world events that take place before the events described in chapter 11, and so on. For others, Revelation is circular or recapitulatory. Proponents of this view agree that the story in the book of Revelation advances, but they contend that it repeats itself. According to this view, the events depicted in the latter portions of the book of Revelation describe the same events that were depicted earlier. The latter events do so in a manner that adds depth or detail to the story here. So one of the outlines I didn't put on here divides up into 7 sections, and each of those 7 sections basically covers the same time period, except that it advances just a little bit more closer to the very absolute end. And so we have this idea, that's why we have all this repetition in the work here. So if you look at the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls, you'll see that they're divided up by the first 4, and there's some similarities between those. And I'm just going to flip through this really fast, but we'll talk about it when we get to our chapter section on that. And then we have the last 2 that are divided up, and then we have this interlude between each of those, except that we see that it says pattern broken under the bowls. And then we have the end, silence, end announcing, celebrated but not described, and then the bowls, chapter 16, 17, and 18 here. Okay, so the previous slide showed some similarities between the seals, trumpets, and bowls. That may be a sign of recapitulation or for another reason. We'll discuss that further next quarter. One more quote before we end this section. The various series of judgments portrayed are parallel descriptions of the same events. The pattern is identical within each series. There is a description of judgment followed by a description of salvation. The first scene of judgment occurs in chapter 6, and then we have a salvation in chapter 7. So we'll stop there for just a second. One of the authors that I've read talks about that the end is always coming but never gets there until the very end of the book. We see a lot of this apocalyptic language where it seems to talk about the destruction of the world, the end times, but it doesn't actually get to the end because John interrupts it and then he goes on to a new section. So you get to the end of the seals, which seems like ultimate destruction. Then he interrupts it. We have this interlude, and then he goes on to the trumpets. And again, get to the end of the trumpets, seems like the final destruction, and then he interrupts it. We have an interlude, goes to the bowls, so forth, and so on. And again, we'll talk more in depth when we get to these sections in the Revelation here. The second scene of judgment is 11:18, and then salvation is 11:18b. Third is chapter 14, salvation is 15. The fourth is 16 through 18, salvation is 19, 1 through 10. The fifth is 20, 7 through 15, salvation is 21. Each depiction of a cycle of events ends in a description of the same final judgment and the same eternal salvation. Why then are the contents of each series not absolutely identical and are sometimes expressed in a slightly different order? Because John is relating what he saw in a series of visions. He is not dictating an exact description of some future historical events. Most of the differences within the various judgments are portrayed in the visions are accounted for by the fact that these plagues recur throughout history in various forms and are not to be understood as portraying one-off historical events. Put another way, the various sets of visions together build a corporate picture of events to come, similar to the way the 4 Gospels build a corporate picture of the ministry of Jesus. Another significant point to note is that John relates the visions in the order in which he saw them. The order in which he saw things happen The order in which he saw things is not necessarily the order in which those things will happen. Some of the visions clearly go back in time to before a previous vision. Thus, the various sets of judgments are not to be understood as different from each other and following one after the other from a chronological perspective. This logic, expressed in the chronological position, will result in at least 5 final judgments. Okay, so when we're looking at the Revelation, everybody agrees that we have a starting point with John and Isle of Patmos, and then it ends with New Jerusalem and Jesus coming down. So everybody agrees on that. It's after that that everybody disagrees on. So we talked about that we have a futurist point of view that would see everything from chapter 4 on as still being future. We have a preterist point of view that would see everything as already have taken place on the extreme side, and the more moderate side says everything's taken place except that last chapter or two. And then we have the idealist position that says these are events that are taking place now, and they're representative of what God is doing in the world, sort of thing. And then, to make matters worse, each author picks and chooses and combines, and they just are a mishmash of everything, which is why there's just so many different outlines out there, because one author likes this device but hates these devices, so organize it this way, and they're just all over the place. So, while there are some strict chronologists and others that are strict recapitulationists, most commentators employ both in their readings of the Revelation. We do want to understand the book starts with John in exile and into the vision of New Jerusalem and Jesus coming. But the most important point for us to remember is what Jesus said in John in 1:3. We are blessed when we hear and obey the words of the prophecy. That is something that we can do. So, he has not given us something that we cannot understand. The revelation is not something that is so far outside our ability to comprehend that we have no hope of comprehending it. It is true that there are any number of parts in it that we won't understand, but the overarching picture is one in which we can understand. As you read the Revelation, you see this idea about being an overcomer, about repenting, about avoiding these sins. And those ideas are repeated at the very end of the book, because that's what John wants the readers, the hearers, us to believe and understand, that we can be overcomers. John wants us to understand that regardless of whether we see the dragon, the sea beast, earth beast, as something that's going to happen way in the future or something that happened way in the past, he wants us to understand absolutely that there are spiritual forces of wickedness that are battling against us and that want nothing more than to destroy us. And the only path forward that leads to salvation is by being washed in the blood of the Lamb. That's what he wants to show each and every one of us. And we can understand those things. Now, whether we, on a personal level, say the seals mirror the trumpets, mirror the bowls, or we say that the seals come first, then the trumpets, then the bowls, or whether we say, and I didn't point this out, some people will see the seventh seal actually are the 7 trumpets. And the 7th trumpet actually is the 7 bowls. So a telescoping sort of outline here. Whether we say any of those things, it really doesn't matter as long as we understand that God wants us to be faithful, and there are reasons for us not to be faithful, Satan, but there are more reasons that we can be faithful, God and Jesus. Questions? Okay. So we spent 3 months looking at various introductory matters pertaining to John's revelation. I imagine we've touched on 1 or 2 issues that perhaps have confused you in the past, made you nervous. Prayerfully, I hope that I've been able to remove some of the confusion that you might have had, but I also realize that I might have added to confusion a time or two. My outline as of present is presented on the next slide. So I don't want you to think I'm going to avoid giving you an outline. I'll go ahead and give you one. Just a second here. So for me, I think it's important that we have the in the Spirit. And so you can see that I have a prologue and epilogue. Then I have vision 1, vision 2, vision 3, vision 4. Okay? So I see those as the 4 major sections of the Revelation here. Under the first vision, takes place in Patmos, we have vision of Christ, last half of chapter 1, and we have the letters to the 7 churches. And I say letters to 7 churches, but they're letters to all the churches. So the letter that was written to Ephesus also applied to Laodicea, Philadelphia. All of them were reading all those letters, which means that they apply to us as well. So we can't just pick and choose and say, well, I want to be a church like Smyrna, I want to be a church like Philadelphia, because there's truth in all those chapters there. And then in chapter 2, we see that John's taken up into heaven, and we see in 4 and 5 a vision of God, and then we see the 7 seals, 7 trumpets. We'll see 3 signs, and that takes place in chapter 12 through 15, and then 7 bowls. And then in chapter 17 through 21, we have the next vision, which is he's carried off into the wilderness, and he sees Babylon, the harlot, and he sees the end, and then he sees New Jerusalem, the bride. And I want you to see, and we'll point this out, that John makes those parallel sections. He's contrasting Babylon with New Jerusalem. He's contrasting the harlot with the bride, and he wants you as the listeners, you as the readers, to ask, where are you in this world? He's not asking where you are physically, because that doesn't matter. He wants to know where you are spiritually. Are you given into Babylon and the seductions of the great whore? Or are you remaining faithful despite the cost and remaining true to Christ and be part of his bride? Any other questions before I flip off that one? Okay. So, next week we'll start our class on the Revelation. You need to read the book. If you don't want to read the book, listen to the book. If you don't want to listen to the book, have somebody read the book to you. Do something so you read it. John did not give his work in a serial fashion. Okay? If you ever read Charles Dickens' works, a lot of it are very serial fashion because he was writing for a newspaper and he would just have one chapter at a time. That's not how John wrote his book. He wrote it to be read and listened to and heard all in one gulp. He wanted you to hear from the start to the end so that you could see those connections. You don't see the connections with the repetition of phrases and words unless you hear it all at once or read it all at once. You're not going to get them all, but you will get some saying, oh, didn't he already talk about that? Didn't he already say that? And that's the only way to do it. So really, I'm going to encourage you to read all of it at one time or listen to it. Any final questions on anything we've covered? Okay, so my expectation for next week is that you guys will read the book. And then we'll start going through the Revelation here. I won't be using the PowerPoint unless I need to. It's very challenging for me. It takes me like an entire day to organize things to do the PowerPoint, and it really ties your hands here. We'll probably bring the board down, and we'll just cover sections at a time here. So if you want to see the board, you may want to move up here next to Norman. He's got good eyes. You can see with him, cheat off his notes. I'm trying to support you, man. Trying to support you. Any other questions? Okay, class dismissed.